So a while back, I said I'd make a video detailing the chronology of the scriptures as I have been reading them in my previous project. I'm finally getting around to it, but it's a lot of stuff. I mean, I did over 2,100 videos in this series. And so we're not going to do it in a single video. I'm going to break this up into portions, into historical periods, and we will do the timeline for each period. So this video will be a timeline for the book of Genesis, as well as all scriptures that take place in the same time period. So this is going to take us from the pre-existence all the way down to the Egyptian captivity. And that is going to be approximately 2,600 years covered. It is the longest period of history with the shortest amount of records, fewest records detailing what happened during this time. So we have very little about this time, but let us get into it. So let us bring it up here. This is our timeline. We're going to start in our first column. We're going to have the book of Genesis. Then we're going to have anything else in the Old Testament that records events for this time period. That is our second column. Third column is the book of Moses. Fourth column is the book of Abraham. Fifth column will be the book of Mormon. And then we have a sixth column that is anything else. There are some historical details that are given in the New Testament and in the Doctrine and Covenants, and they're going to be in this last column, the sixth column, others. Now also, we're not going to just say chapter and this chapter and this chapter. Let's go through what is happening in each of these historical periods, what is happening at this time. So let us first start with the pre-existence. Where do we read about the events of the pre-existence? Not just mentions of it again. This isn't to outline where every scripture that mentions it is. So I mean, in Job, we have that mention, where were you when the sons of God shouted for joy? That's a reference to the pre-existence. But it's not telling it's not a historical narrative about the pre-existence, so it's not going to be included here. For the pre-existence, what we have is first Moses, chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. And this is kind of the origin of Satan. This is the story of Satan and Christ being presented to God. Here am I, send me. That's that. We then have Abraham, chapter 3, verses 22 through 28, which details the noble and great ones and how God assembled the spirits or the intelligences before the world was. We then have, very briefly in the New Testament, in John chapter 1, some mention of Christ being the creator in the pre-existent world. And this is verses 1 through 5 and then 8 through 13. This is just a little note that I like to tack on there. After the pre-existence, we have the story of the creation. Now, this is going to be recorded in Genesis, Moses, and Abraham. Genesis chapter 1, Moses chapter 2, and Abraham chapter 4. These all detail what we would call the 6 days of creation. And they tell basically the same story, although Abraham does make it clear that during the 6 days we're not talking about the creation of physical life, but just spirits as the earth is being prepared to support life. We then go to Genesis chapter 2, Moses chapter 3, and Abraham chapter 5. And this gives us the creation of physical life on the earth, starting with Adam, then the plants as God plants the garden, then the animals, and then Eve. So this is our creation story. Creation of the earth and spirits, and then the creation of physical life. Then we get the accounts of the Garden of Eden. This is recorded only in Genesis and in Moses. Genesis chapter 3 and Moses chapter 4, verses 5 through 32. Because remember, the first 4 verses of Moses chapter 4 deals with the pre-existence and kind of the war in heaven. So we only have from verse 5 on. And this is what's going on in the garden, the fall of Adam and Eve. Then we get a little bit about the early years of Adam and Eve, and this is Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. We get a little bit more of it in Moses chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. This was where we read of Adam making his sacrifices and the angel coming and asking him why and all that. Following this narrative, we get the story of Cain and Abel. And this will be Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 18, as well as Moses chapter 5, verses 18 through 43. Now this is not exactly in chronological order, because the rest of chapter 4 in Genesis and chapter 5 in Moses is a little bit of the history of the descendants of Cain. Now by the time Lamech comes on the scene, which is our main player in this narrative, he is 6 or 7 generations after Cain, meaning he's about the same time period as Enoch. Probably just after Enoch is translated, or possibly just before Enoch is translated, we get the story of Lamech murdering his great-grandfather Irad in order to defend or protect these secret combinations. That would have happened about the same time as the story of Enoch. But then after that we get the birth of Seth, And this is recorded in Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. We get a little bit more of it in Moses chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And this is also where it is mentioned that they kept a book of remembrance, that they actually did record what was going on. They kept their own scriptures even in the times of Adam. Adam started writing the first scriptures. But then in chapter 5, Genesis 5 and Moses 6, we have the genealogy of the faithful descendants of Seth. Now, of course, this is parallel to Genesis chapter 4. This is also recorded in Moses chapter 6, verses 10 through 24. You'll also get this very briefly in the book of 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. It takes you through the same genealogy. Now, the story of Enoch we get very briefly in Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. Very brief, just as you know, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And that's all we get. But this is where we get in Moses our biggest addition. Moses, starting in chapter 6, verse 25, we get the ministry of Enoch. And this takes us through chapter 7. After the ministry of Enoch and Enoch City is translated, we get the rest of the genealogy down to Noah. This is Genesis chapter 5, verses 25 to 32, as well as the chapter 8 of Moses. It also continues into Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. This portion of the genealogy is also recorded very briefly in 1 Chronicles chapter 1. The next thing we have is the flood, and that is recorded only in Genesis. The story of Noah. The flood is in chapter 6, part of chapter 7. Noah sacrificing the rainbow put in the sky. I believe that's chapter 8. Chapter 9 is Noah getting drunk. All these things about Noah and the flood and immediately after the flood. We get to chapter 10. This is what we call the list of nations. And this is where it lists all the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. Now, of course, this is listing only their sons, not their daughters. They had daughters as well. And we learn a little bit about this in Abraham chapter 1, where Abraham tells us about the ancestry of the Egyptians, how Pharaoh was the son of Egyptus, and Egyptus was the daughter of Ham. That's where this all tells you. Abraham chapter 1, verses 23 through 27 tells us the history of Egypt. And that would have been at the same time, during this time period, covered by the list of nations. Now, you also get some of this in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 26. And this is more focused on the descendants of Shem. This list of nations will also be found in 1 Chronicles. Now, this is where we get a little bit of confusing here. Because so far it's been a generally chronological order presented in Genesis. We did have that one time we had the descendants of Cain and then the descendants of Seth, which we have to kind of line up. But this is where it gets confusing. We have this list of nations. The next story in Genesis is the Tower of Babel. However, the early years of Abraham almost certainly were before the Tower of Babel. And so in this timeline, we put Abraham from Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 to 30. This is Abraham's early years. Then we go back to the beginning of the chapter, verses 1 through 9, and this is the story of the Tower of Babel. So this is also where we pick it up in the book of Ether, in the Book of Mormon. Ether chapter 1. Now, of course, Ether chapter 1 has the list of the Jaredite kings all the way down to Ether. So the descendants of Jared down to Ether. That's kind of where we pick it up in Ether chapter 1. But then the rest of the chapter talks about the brother of Jared and their doings at the Tower of Babel. This would have all happened about this same time. Abraham is about 50 years old, around there. The Tower of Babel occurs. The brother of Jared is contemporaneous to Abraham. Whether they personally knew each other, we don't know. After the Tower of Babel, we then have the life of Abraham, which picks up in Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 and 32. That gives us continuing the story of Abraham. We also continue the story of the Jaredites in Ether chapter 2. Then we come down, we get the rest of Abraham chapter 1 through 22 and 28 through 31, and facsimile 1. All of that tells the story of Abraham's life after leaving Haran for the first time. Probably it says he was 75 years old. So this is about 25 years after the Tower of Babel. We get a little bit more detail about this in the book of Abraham. We then have to follow the story of the Jaredites a little more. Ether chapter 3, the appearing of Christ to the brother of Jared, the crossing of the great waters, all that's happening about the same time as Abraham chapter 1. Where we fill in the details of Abraham's life, we also get the details of the Jaredites. Now, of course, this account from Ether really only takes us through chapter 3. Chapters 4 and 5 are commentary written by Moroni, so would be included in the time period of Moroni, not the time period of the Jaredites. So we skip from chapter 3 to chapter 6. So I have to make a quick correction. As I was editing my video, I realized I made an error. My whole table is a little off here when it comes to the life of Abraham, the early life. Now, I was not in error when I stated that Abraham was probably around 50 years old at the time of the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel is described in Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. My error was saying that Abraham chapter 1 takes place after Genesis 11. It doesn't. It actually takes place during Genesis 11. So the way it really should line up to get this right is in Genesis 11, verses 27 through 30 is while they are still in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Abraham chapter 1 takes place while they are in Ur of the Chaldeans. So, Abraham chapter 1 actually lines up to Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 and 28. Verses 29 and 30 in Genesis line up to the first 3 verses of Abraham chapter 2. And then in Abraham chapter 2, verse 4, God commands Abraham to leave Ur because of a famine that has gone very bad in the land. And so Abraham, with his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, his father, and his brother, leave Ur of the Chaldees. Now this is verses 29 and 30 in Genesis 11, and that is the beginning of Abraham chapter 2. It is my opinion that the Tower of Babel occurred immediately before this famine. Now, in the book of Abraham, it says that after God delivers Abraham from the priest of Elkanah, he sends a famine in the land of Ur. I believe the famine coincides with the Tower of Babel. So they try to sacrifice Abraham. Then we have the Tower of Babel, famine spreads throughout the land of Ur, and Abraham and his family leave Ur, come into Haran, where Abraham's brother and father stay, and then God commands Abraham to continue farther south into the land of Canaan. And so I wanted to make that correction for this video, and to correct the table that I'm using here, just to make it more accurate. So we skip from chapter 3 to chapter 6. Reading verses 1 through 18, and that brings us up to the proper time. In Genesis now, chapter 12, we get Abraham in Egypt. Now this lines up to Abraham chapter 2, and you can see here how each part of these chapters line up. It is also true that at this time we have what is recorded in facsimile 2 and 3 in the book of Abraham. And this is where the book of Abraham stops. We are now finished with the book of Abraham. Then we get to the meat of the Abrahamic story. And this takes us from chapter 13 through chapter 24 of Genesis. This is about 12 chapters focused on the story of Abraham. He is the main character. We have the birth of Ishmael, the coming of the angels, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the events with Lot. We have the birth of Isaac. All this stuff going on in these chapters. And I put them all together because there's no portion of any other scripture that deals with this time period. So there's no New Testament or Doctrine and Covenants that gives us more detail about the life of Abraham. It's all here. But there are a couple of things to note. And that is that it is at this time period that the story of the book of Job takes place. Now, the book of Job was most likely written centuries later, probably during or just before the Babylonian captivity. But the man, Job, would have lived probably during the time period of Abraham. And we can kind of gauge that from the fact that Job lives to be, I think, a little over 200 years old. So his age lines up to this time period of Abraham. So we're going to put Job here as another Old Testament source of something that happened during the life of Abraham. And then, of course, we have to add in a little bit of the book of Ether in chapter 6, 19 through 30. This portion of Ether is taking place about the same time period as the life of Abraham. Now, in Genesis chapter 25, we did have a little bit more of the kind of the concluding story of Abraham, his death, verses 1 through 10, I believe. And then the rest of chapter 25 is listing the descendants of Ishmael and Abraham's other sons, which were born to his third wife, Keturah. I think he had 8 sons born to Keturah. And this portion is detailing their descendants. So again, just like with the descendants of Cain being parallel to the descendants of Seth, this portion would actually be in parallel with the stories of Isaac and Jacob that follow. But we just put it here because you don't want to read one verse and like that. It's a little annoying. So you want to just read that, get that understanding that this is during the same time period. Then we move into the stories of Isaac and Jacob. This picks us up in Genesis chapter 25, verse 19. And you'll note this is also about the same time period as Ether, chapter 7, but only verses 1 through 3, because Ether crams a lot of time period into only a few verses. Now, the story of Isaac and Jacob picks up in chapter 25, goes on through chapter 26, At this time, we do have a portion in Chronicles that gives us a little bit of the genealogy that's going on here. But then it continues. The story of Isaac and Jacob actually takes us all the way down to Genesis chapter 45. This is when Joseph gets sold into Egypt. And this is a little bit before this. We get in chapter 45 or 44 is where we get the next portion of Ether, which would be chapter 7, verses 4 through 7. And that takes place before Joseph is sold into Egypt, but during that time period of Jacob's sons. In chapter 46 of Genesis, Joseph is sold into Egypt, and we get the rest of the story of Genesis, chapter 46 to 50. In parallel to this, we have Ether, chapter 7, verses 8 to 27. This is where we get a little more detail of what's going on with the Jaredites, but it's still not a lot of detail, but we get a little bit more. And this brings us to the end of Genesis. This is the Israelites entering Egypt. During this time period, we read the book of Moses, book of Abraham, read just a little bit in the first chapter of First Chronicles because it lists these genealogies from this time period. We also have the book of Job that takes place about the same time as Abraham. In the book of Mormon, we have the first several chapters of Ether taking us from chapter 1 through most of chapter 7, but excluding chapters 4 and 5. Now, I haven't mentioned it as I was going along, but you'll note, as I've had it coming up here, there are references from the Doctrine and Covenants as well. Now, Doctrine and Covenants 84 gives us the priesthood ancestry of Moses. So it tells us that, Moses was ordained by Jethro, who was ordained by Caleb, and so on back. And so you get these references on section 84 about when the priesthood was handed down from one generation to the next. This goes all the way back to Adam, as you can see. You'll also note a few references from section 107. This is all during the time before the flood, what we call the antediluvian era. And this is listing when these early patriarchs were all ordained to the patriarchal priesthood. And this was the priesthood of the presidency, the priesthood to preside over your descendants. And so in 107 we get exactly when each of these men were ordained. So I've got it listed here. Now, in my reading, I did not follow this exactly, because when I first started out, it was kind of a casual thing. And so some, especially the early readings around the creation and stuff, weren't quite in order. I would say not until I got into adding in the book of Ether was I really starting to actually be careful about what I put where in the timeline. When it comes to the John, talking about the pre-existence and the Doctrine and Covenants, I read all those with the reading in the New Testament and the Doctrine and Covenants. I did not read them at all chronologically. There's not really enough information there. It's interesting to show, but there's not really enough information there to justify individual readings. So I didn't do that. But this is how it all falls into place. So if you want to go in and try this experiment or try this series on your own, this is how you would line up Genesis to the rest of the scriptures. And you can go in, and if you want to do it on your own, and you can include the Doctrine and Covenants and John as you're reading, fill in a little bit of the information. Do it how you want, but this is the timeline of events in the scriptures, from pre-existence down to the Israelites entering Egypt. Now in our next video, I will talk about the Exodus, time period basically from Moses to the end of the reign of the judges, what we would call then the reign of the kings. So Moses to King Saul. That will be our next video. If you enjoy it, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.